Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We are in Nehemiah chapter 13. We're going to be starting verse 10 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, in verses 10 to 14, we're going to be looking at the purifying of giving tithes. So here, remember, chapter 13, Nehemiah is doing a lot of purifying. Purifies the people, purifies the temple. And now here in verses 10 to 14, the purifying of giving tithes. And let's read it. It says here, And I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, for the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled every one to his field. Then I contended with the rulers, and I said, Why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together, and I set them in their place. Then brought all Judah the tithe of the corn, and the new wine, and the oil unto the treasuries. And I made treasuries over the treasures over the treasuries, Shelemiah the priest and Zadok the scribe, and of the Levites Pedaiah, and next unto them was Hanai, and the son of Zakur, the son of Mattaniah, for they were counted faithful, and their office was to distribute unto their brethren. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and wipe not out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God, and for the offices thereof. Now, in this portion of scripture, the Jewish people that were not of the tribe of Levi, every year God required that they were to bring to the house of God a tithe offering, a tithe of the crops that they grew, a tithe of the barley, the wheat, the corn, whatever they grew, they were to bring in 10% unto the 10% or a tithe unto the house of God. And what happened is they stopped doing it. So because of that, it says here in verse 11, Then contended I with the rulers, why is the house of God forsaken? They had forsaken the house of God. To leave out the tithes in God's eyes was to forsake God's house. And it says here in verse 10, I perceived that the portion of the Levites had not been given unto them. How did he perceive it? Why? The next part of verse 10 says, because the Levites and the singers that did the work, they had gone home to their own fields. It wasn't the Levites and the singers, those that were responsible for the ministry of God at the temple. They weren't supposed to be farmers and growing their own crops for their own. No, it was the people, the other Jewish tribes were supposed to be bringing in their tithes to the temple so that the priests and the Levites could have food as an offering unto God. And it wasn't being done. The Levites and the singers had to leave off work in the temple so that they could go home to their fields and get food to eat. And this wasn't right. Nehemiah puts the blame not on the Levites or the singers, but he puts the blame on the rulers of the people in verse 11, who should have enforced God's laws to the people to bring in the tithes. As he says here, then contended I with the rulers, and I said, why is the house of God forsaken? He goes to the rulers of the other 11 tribes and says, look, this isn't right. You guys are not doing what God commanded in the law of Moses. We're supposed to be bringing in the tithe into the house of God, so that God's people who are ministering at the temple can have their provisions. The prophet Malachi, in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 8, says that to do this, to forsake the house of God and to not bring in the tithes, is actually robbing God. They were robbing God. To not bring in the tithes was stealing from God, because they were supposed to give of their fruits and of the things they grew as a sacrifice, as a thankful offering unto God, that he caused the caused the wheat to grow, right, and the apples to grow and everything. They were supposed to bring it in, but they didn't. And because of that, Malachi says you're robbing God. It's not people you're robbing. God sees it as you stealing from him. What makes what the people did even worse is that just a couple of years before this time, in Nehemiah chapter 13, that they had promised that they would not forsake the house of God. And we see that in Nehemiah chapter 10 and verse 39. Let's read Nehemiah chapter 10 and verse 39. And it says here, "For the children of Israel and the children of Levi shall bring the offerings of the corn, of the new wine, and of the oil into the chambers where are the vessels of the sanctuary, and the priests that minister, and the porters and the singers, and we will not forsake the house of our God." That's what they said. But you know what? A couple years later, that's what they were doing. They were stealing from God. They weren't bringing in the crops as they were supposed to. Now, let's get into verses 15 to 22. And in these verses, we see the purity of the Sabbath day. The purity of the Sabbath day. Now, let's read verses 15 to 22. And it says, "In those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath day, and bringing in sheaves and lading asses, as also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. There dwelt men of Tyre also therein, which brought fish and all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah, and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah, and I said unto them, What evil thing is this that you do, and profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same thing? And did not our God bring all this evil upon us and upon this city? Yet we bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And some of my servants said I sat them at the gates, that there should no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day." So Nehemiah has all the gates of the city shut on this beginning of the Sabbath to the end of the Sabbath. Not only is that enough, he also sets up guards. You watch, make sure nobody comes in here on the Sabbath day. Verse 20. "So the merchants and sellers of all kinds of ware, they lodged outside of Jerusalem once or twice." That means, this coming Sabbath, they were sitting there. The gates were closed, and they're waiting for the gates to open. This is Sabbath day, and they're sitting there waiting. And then the next Sabbath, they wait again. And every Sabbath, they're sitting there waiting for those gates to open. Verse 21, then I testified against them, and I said unto them, why lodge ye around the wall? If you do it again, I will lay hands on you. From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should come and keep the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy. Now, in the time that Nehemiah had gone to Babylon, the people slacked off on their keeping of the Sabbath day. Their desire for their earthly provisions on the Sabbath was more important than what God had said. Right before the captivity took place, God warned the children of Israel about their buying and selling on the Sabbath day. You can read that in Jeremiah 17, verses 19 to 27. God warned them way back before Nebuchadnezzar came and took them away to Babylon. God said, you're profaning the Sabbath. You're buying, you're selling, you're doing things on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to be doing it. If you don't stop, I'm going to take you captive. I'm going to have Nebuchadnezzar come down and take you captive away. And that's what happened, because they didn't stop. Now Nehemiah sees the same danger of God's wrath upon them if they keep it up. He says that in verse 18. The Sabbaths belong to God in Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 12. And any disobedience on the Sabbath days was a direct disregard to God who gave the Sabbath. So God sees it as a direct sin against him to disobey the Sabbath and not to rest. But Christians also need to beware of their attitude toward the Christian Sabbath, which is the first day of the week, which is our Sunday. Every Christian should take one day a week and devote it unto God. If it can't be Sunday, which is the first day of the week, well, because you work on that day or whatever, then make it another day. But every Christian should have one day a week where you give it unto God. Well, I'm too busy. I got this going on and that, and I got to go to the store, and my only day off is Tuesday or Wednesday, and I got to get things done. Listen, I'm telling you, we need to take one day a week and give it unto God and devote it unto him to pray and to read his word. It's health to our spirit and health to our soul. Neglecting to give God one day a week out of a Christian's life reveals their heart towards God and has helped contribute to their backsliding. After all that God has done for us today, and 2,000 years ago, doesn't God deserve at least one day and maybe even more than one day a week? After all that he's given, if you're sucking air in your lungs, that's the grace of God. If you're eating dinner today and you got food on your table, that's the grace of God. That because of those things, you know what? We need to take one day a week and thank God that he's given us food to eat, a home to live in. And because of what he did for us 2,000 years ago, we need to give him one day a week. After all, he paid for our sins. He deserves one day, at least one day a week, where we can give it unto him. It's an unthankful and an ungrateful and a selfish heart that lives for itself and makes their own decisions 7 days a week. Isaiah 58, 13 and 14 is right. Is God's what God says about the Sabbath day. Do we delight in God on our Sabbath day? Or do we see spending time with God in prayer and Bible study as boring? Do we delight in God? Isaiah 13 and Isaiah 58, 13 and 14. Keep your foot from the house of God. Hang on, let's read Isaiah 58, verse 13 and 14. And he says here, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shall honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words. Then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and will feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. Listen, do we delight in God on the Sabbath day? Do we have a delight in our heart for the things of God, for his word? Are we bored with God? Are we bored with his word? Are we more interested in our own pleasures, and are we seeking our own pleasures and our own ways, how to make our own life happy and easy? Or do we delight in God? God promises us great blessings if we honor him one day a week. In verse 19, the Christian needs to always be on the lookout for anything that will interfere with your time with God. What does he say in verse 19? And it came to pass, listen, came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And some of my servants did I set at the gates, that they should not burden, there should be no burden be brought into the Sabbath day, into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So listen, sometimes when like with Nehemiah, if he allowed those people to stay there on the Sabbath day to lodge, that's like a temptation. That's like a temptation to want to open those gates. I mean, our provisions and all these nice flowery, sparkly things are just outside the gate waiting to come in. And sometimes sin is that close to us. Sometimes the things of this world are very close to the gates of our heart. And it's a temptation for us to want to just, open up the gates a little bit and just let them come in, and we can barter with them. We can buy and sell with the world's goods and fancies and things. And so Nehemiah here, he says, in verse 21, then I testified against them, and I said, why are you lodging about the wall? If you do it again, I'll lay hands on you. And from that time forth, they came no more. Chase it away. This is what Nehemiah did. He says, I'm going to chase that temptation away. Get it out of here. I don't want it anywhere near the wall, and where people can look over the wall and find out that, the temptation is right there on the other side of the wall. And some people, as the things of this world, as sin and lust come closer and closer to the wall, there's more of a temptation to open up the walls of their heart and let it in. In verses 20 and 21, there will always be temptations to distract you away from God and to be occupied with the things of this world. And in verse 22, not only is the day holy, but we should be holy also on that day. As people put on their Sunday best to go to church, so we also should desire to be pure and holy unto God on that day, on that Sabbath day. Verse 22, and I commanded the Levites that they should what? Cleanse themselves, and that they should come and keep the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. So here, Nehemiah wanted the people to be clean. He wanted the temptations to go away. He wanted God to be honored on the Sabbath day and not to have distractions. He wanted the people to focus their hearts on God and the goodness of God. And this is what we should do. We should pick one day a week, whatever it is. I do Sundays as best as I can. I try to devote my Sundays unto God and to pray and to read His Word and to study and not no TV, no whatever and things. Go to church and come home and spend time with my wife and then study and pray and give it unto God. I'm not interested in news or anything like that. I don't care what's going out in the world. That Sundays are my time with God and honoring Him. And that's what we should do. We shouldn't get bogged down with the things of this world. We need to dedicate at least one day a week unto God where we give it unto Him. And this is what Nehemiah was doing. Let's give one day a week unto God. This is what he said. This is what God said that we should do. And it's healthy for us. It's healthy for our spirit. It's healthy for our relationship unto God. All right, next lesson we're going to start verse 23, and verses 23 to 27 is the purity of Israel's identity. All right, but until then, walk with the Lord. I know He walks with you.